Good afternoon, perhaps morning, wherever you are. As Executive Director of Resilience First, it's my pleasure to welcome you this afternoon to this webinar organised by Resilience First in conjunction with Paul Ray. Resilience First's mission is to help build resilience across business communities, whether those communities be defined by geography or special interest. Please do visit our website, www.resilience1st.co.uk, to see the many projects and events we organise throughout the year in an effort to help your understanding and application of resilience. We have recently formed a strategic partnership with the Resilient Shift organisation, so both our reach and output have expanded for hopefully the greater good. Today's webinar is topical. In the light of recent events in government positions, we hope this guide will prove valuable in the public, private and voluntary sectors. The event marks the launch of our latest publication titled Operational Resilience, a Guide for Non-Executive Directors. We are delighted to release this at this event and to welcome a number of prominent speakers, including contributors to the document itself. We are also pleased to have Paul Ray represented, as without their help today, the event would not have been possible, and neither the guide. By way of short introduction, let me say that the guide for so-called NEDs is a compilation of several people's thoughts and views. We do not see the guide as a static one-off publication, but more a dynamic living product that will, we hope, go on to be on a web portal, so that readers can access and exchange views. Hence, this is just the start of a journey, which we trust will prove valuable not only to NEDs, but also to those who advise and support NEDs in fulfilling their respective roles. You can help this journey by letting us have your comments, whether they're positive or negative, to the guide subsequent to the webinar. And you will all receive a copy of the guide after the event. I will shortly invite Ed Butler from Paul Ray to say a few words by way of introduction to the event as the sponsor. And I will then ask our chairman, Simon Collins, to provide an overview of the guide and to chair the proceedings today. As former chairman of KPMG, Simon is well placed to see how boards and NEDs operate. Simon will introduce our speakers who will offer their experiences from the public and private sectors, including a welcome contribution from the Prudential Regulation Authority, an organisation which has itself recently produced a guide or a policy on operational resilience for the financial sector. I should emphasise that this part of the event will be under the Chatham House rule of non-attribution, and I ask you to respect that requirement. Throughout the session, I encourage all of you listening to ask questions of the speakers by posting brief questions in the chat box to the right of your screen. I'm sure the chair will pick up as many as he can in the Q&A session. So lastly, I'd add that the proceedings are being recorded, except for the PRA's contribution, and we will share an edited summary at the end after a few days. Simon, the virtual floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. And first and foremost, let me hand over to Ed for a sponsor's introduction. Ed.
Good afternoon, everyone, and hopefully you can hear me. All right, my name is Ed Butler. I'm the Chief Resilience Officer at Paul Ray, the government-backed terrorism reinsurer. My responsibilities among a number of them within the company is to work with our risk consulting team, which we call Paul Ray Solutions. And I also lead on our operational resilience policy and planning, formerly known as crisis management and business continuity. I'm also, and I think of relevance to this debate, a senior independent advisor to the licensee board of EDF Energy Generation, who manage the operation and now the defueling and decommissioning of UK's nuclear operating fleet. And I provide there, hopefully as the guide says, at the right altitude, strategic advice and input on the full range of issues under consideration by the management team, as well as acting, as I like to think, as a critical friend to some of their strategy and business decisions. So why then has Pool Re sponsored this, what I think is an excellent guide for non-execs, and certainly I've read it with interest and continue to do so, and will encourage our board members at Pool Re that they read the copy as well. By way of background, Pool Re's public policy objective over the last 27 years is to improve the resilience of the UK economy to terrorism incidents. We do this with the provision of terrorism reinsurance for our 130 or so members, and collectively we have an exposure of 2.2 trillion of commercial property to terrorism attack, not a significant figure. The main purpose of Pool Re's scheme is to provide cover for catastrophic terrorism events, such as a 9/11 type event, a CBRNE event, or a cyber terrorism event. And these types of events could lead to claims of over tens of billions of pounds, which would require us to draw down on the loan facility, the government guarantee, to ensure solvency for our members and thereby facilitate the rebuilding of the economy, i.e. underpinning economic resilience of the country. Part of our strategy is on identifying and closing protection gaps, improving our customers' awareness and knowledge of the risk. And this involves enhanced risk modelling and investing in risk management and mitigation initiatives and making the customer a better insurance risk. Simon, if I may just take the liberty of a couple of thoughts on resilience and possible considerations for non-execs based on my own experiences. First off, what is clear to me is that there's been a paradigm shift in risk management as a result of COVID-19 and the notion of extreme risk. You might ask, what is extreme risk and how is this evaluated and quantified? Following on from this, how can extreme risk be mitigated? I suggest that the focus is now on a question on business survivability and securing enduring resilience. Companies have to, in my opinion, not already recognise their need to adapt as they look at implementing new strategies and plans to protect their people, assets, reputation and share value in this increasing VUCA world we operate in. And in my opinion, this is core business for non-execs. I also suggest, if it's not presumption, but it's the responsibility of non-execs to propose to their executives that they revisit their realistic disaster scenarios and see what's changed in the light of a genuine catastrophic risk, such as the ongoing global pandemic and associated strategic business interruption. Following on from this, they may want to ask the question whether there is a comprehensive strategic tail risk assessment has been undertaken, and if so, have all the extreme remote risks been fully assessed? And how does this differ from standard risk management practices and policies which the company may have in place, and if so, how? Next, I think there's this concern about the exclusion of catastrophic risks. And I think again down to the non-execs to ensure that potentially catastrophic risks are not excluded because they're in the all too difficult trauma. For example, the terrorist use of a bioweapon or a dirty radiological device, or a cyber attack which takes down the national grid or the World Wide Web. They need to look at the indirect consequences and how to manage them. And COVID-19 has already shown us that we cannot ignore the high impact, low probability events that sit on our risk registers. Ultimately, I think they need to ask the question about which black elephants, as opposed to black swans, might impact on the business, i.e. those events, those catastrophic risks which are already in the room, but you've probably chosen to discount up till now. And then the final question is to ask is, and this is insurance related if I may, whether the company's insurance policy is appropriate to cover the full spectrum of risks. It's probably worth reviewing your company's current insurance program and confirming that the correct assumptions have been made with respect to the threat, the vulnerability assessment, the security plan and the mitigation measures, as well as truly understanding the appetite of the business and or the board to accept or transfer that risk through insurance cover. That's a very short introduction for me, and I'll be delighted to take any questions appropriate during the panel session. And I'll now hand back to you, Simon, to introduce the other speakers and the rest of the session. So thank you, Robert, for that opportunity to talk.
Ed, thank you very much indeed. And hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us. And big thanks from me to Robert and to Ed. Robert for shouldering with his team the preparation of the guide and this webinar. And Ed, of course, and all of your colleagues at Pool Re for your generous support and sponsorship, without which, as Robert said, the guide simply wouldn't be possible. As Robert mentioned, Resilience First is a small organisation, and we exist to improve resilience in business and the community. We're not trying to duplicate or reinvent because we don't have the resources to do that. So instead, what we're trying to do is be a sort of nimble curator and try and collect and collate best practice. I think over the last 18 months or so, companies have really demonstrated to us just how much they've had to do around resilience. It's been hard. They've done well, in my view. Brexit and COVID have caused disruptions in supply chain, people and working procedures, health and safety. We've had financial stress, cybersecurity threats. None of the usual stuff stopped, but there's so much more. Many businesses, I think, have done really brilliantly, but my discussions, that of my colleagues in Resilience First, and our observations suggest that some boards have found it difficult to determine how best to help with resilience. I think that we all know that a sort of endless non-exec questioning and challenging of stretched execs may not be the answer, but providing a sort of experience, diversity of experience, challenge, support, scrutiny, and mentoring, where I've seen that work, it's really provided a sort of patchwork quilt of support and additional firepower to help companies get through. So brilliant when it works, but not always easy to see how it should work. The NEDs that we've spoken to, this is my experience as well, often struggle with, you see in the guide, what I call the altitude question. You know, we all know that at 100,000 feet, we can get a really good overview, but there's no detail, very hard to get involved. Equally, at the ground level, we risk confusion, interference with exec colleagues, and so on. And so getting that right is a really important thing. Many guides exist to help NEDs in their roles, and we know that, but they tend to be quite what I think of as sort of governance-y in nature. And we wanted to see if a practical guide based on shared learning and experiences could work to help NEDs, particularly around the subject of resilience. You'll be the judge of whether it works, but I'm very proud of our first NEDs guide iteration, and I use the word iteration deliberately because we intend this guide, as Robert said, to be an online, living, breathing guide that's continually honed and edited and updated by the real experience of real NEDs. So please do see it, treat it, use it, and add to it in that light. Enough from me with the guide and with our excellent speakers to illuminate it. First, it's my privilege to invite Serene Andrews to speak to us. Ian is a massively experienced and distinguished NED, a public servant, and also, I think, a terrific thinker around governance and stewardship issues, and he's going to talk to us a little bit about that. Ian, thank you. Over to you.
Simon, thank you. No pressure then. Good afternoon, everyone. Well, the obligation on non-executive directors to ensure that the effective governance of their organisation, I don't think has ever been more vital than it is today, nor has it ever been more onerous. In my experience, almost anything that goes wrong, whether in the public, private or third sectors, can ultimately be traced back to a failure of governance in one form or another. And having held executive and non-executive roles in both public sector and charity boards, I've been able to observe those in the private sector at close quarters as both a client and an investor. I'm in no doubt about the importance of the part that non-executives have to play in the process of ensuring the operational resilience of their organizations. But sadly, albeit with the benefit of hindsight, when the inevitable crisis occurs, too often they appear to have failed to rise to the challenge. So how can they contribute most effectively to the health and well-being, the success and the resilience of their organization? In addition to the obvious obligation to oversee financial probity and to safeguard the integrity and reputation of the organization, the NED should provide the executive with a source of guidance, support, and, when appropriate, constructive challenge. And that includes being prepared to focus their attention on what they, or indeed other members of the board, might not find it convenient or even welcome to have to address. And in turn, that means being able to ask the right questions in the right way at the right time, and, if appropriate, warning if the enterprise is cruising into danger. It's not implying any lack of trust, but rather a need to achieve a genuine consensus based on shared understanding that is essential to shared accountability. In recent times, attention has progressively shifted away from simply safeguarding the short-term interests of shareholders and ensuring compliance with regulatory obligations, towards acknowledging the risks of the wider stakeholder community, the interests of the wider stakeholder community. Whether that's internally, in the form of the people who actually generate the wealth, or the wider economy and society, which often unknowingly subsidize its creation, or worse, pay the price of its consequences. What is becoming known as stewardship focuses on the medium and long-term sustainability of the enterprise and its impact on society and on the community it serves. And effective governance in this context embraces aspects of business ethics, performance, legitimacy, and above all, resilience. Financial markets and institutional investors are beginning to flex their muscles by viewing companies through a sustainability lens. They're paying closer attention to the track record of delivery against proclaimed environmental, social, and governance commitments when they're considering material risks and growth opportunities. In the public and charity sectors too, the demands of public accountability and the regulatory scrutiny impose additional obligations on non-executives and trustees to address resilience. Indeed, this has surely been brought into particularly sharp focus by the events of the pandemic over the last 18 months. It is certainly no walk in the park. It requires genuine skill to know what questions to ask when and in what way. It doesn't necessarily require deep subject matter knowledge. Indeed, to have it might actually fuel complacency amongst other board members by discouraging them from expressing concerns or by asking what might be perceived to be a daft question. There can be no such thing as a daft question. There can only be two answers to any question. One which addresses the issue in a comprehensible way to the complete satisfaction of the questioner, or one that does not, whether it exposes the fact that the executive didn't know the answer, or is unable or unwilling to provide it in terms which are easily and readily understandable. And in that case, the question has successfully exposed a risk to the enterprise which must be addressed. The answer too often is to reach for the risk register for assurance, but risk registers are not there just to be admired. They're of no value unless they are used to develop and exercise contingency plans. They need to provide the focus for questions which test what is being done to mitigate them, absorb their impact if and when they occur, and the measures in place to recover afterwards. Who is responsible for the business continuity plan? When was it last exercised? And are there succession plans in place in the event, as will inevitably be the case, that none of the right people is in the right place when the risk materializes? As we face up to the consequences of recovery from the pandemic and the search for the lessons to be learned, it is incumbent on non-executives to ensure that their boards focus not just on what might have been done better last time, but how their organizations can be made more resilient in the face of whatever potentially catastrophic disruption might be in store. If organizations are genuinely resilient, they will be thinking about what they must do to prepare for the next war and not just planning to refight the last one better. Today, to be an effective non-executive requires real skills as much as any other board role. But governance skills are very different from management skills. And this and the need for the right training and development is too often not recognized either by the individual or by the appointing organization. Hopefully, this guide will provide a small contribution to raising awareness and improving the quality of governance itself, as well as ensuring that organisations are better prepared to respond to, absorb and recover from future crises, whatever form they might take. Simon, back to you.
Ian, thank you very much. And I always feel haunted and slightly guilty every time I hear you say risk registers are not just there to be admired. I always think nervously about my own boards and organisations when I hear that. Now, our plan now is to turn to Jack Armstrong, but we're having some IT issues. I just want to check, Jack, are you there and can you hear me?
Yes, all good, thank you.
Perfect. In which case, I can introduce you with more confidence. Jack, thank you for joining us. You're Director of Operational Resilience at EY, obviously as a consulting capacity, but have formerly held that role at the Bank of England and well placed to shine some light on it for us. So thank you, and the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. I used to work with Karen, so it's good to share a floor with her again, even if it is virtually. So thank you very much for asking me to come along. I was just going to spend a brief few minutes talking about the different skill sets that I've seen and noticed are very useful within the NED population to provide that kind of oversight and challenge around resilience. Now, it's quite tricky to start off with this because resilience in its current form is quite new. If you think about all the things that kind of contribute towards resilience as an outcome, they've been around for a very long time. But actually, you're never expecting to see a NED with some kind of hands-on or live resilience experience. So actually, it's about what have they got and what can they have as a background or a complementary skill set to enable them to provide that effective oversight and challenge of the boards that they sit on and the resilience agenda as it's being seen across all different sectors at the moment. So I kind of came up with 6 broad buckets, which are definitely not exclusive or exhaustive, but I think are some of the foundational areas that just to kind of allow that questioning and challenge with hopefully some knowledge and insight, as well as just the generic, of course, common sense, as I always like to say, resilience is the foundation of. So what are these 6? The first one for me is operational experience. So if you think about resilience as being an end-to-end service that's provided, and it really goes across the full spectrum of prevent, detect, respond, learn, recover. And what you're really looking for is people who understand how services are delivered, how operations work, and how things are dealt with during disruption. So anyone who's had any type of kind of COO role or operations role alive where they are managing and responsible for service, resilience almost comes second nature to them because that's just been their job for a number of years. So even though they may not think of themselves as resilience professionals, actually all the things they do on a day-to-day basis and the fundamental understanding of how services and organizations work and how harm occurs, be it to end users, customers, markets, your own safety and soundness, hopefully that's all reasonably intrinsic to their understanding. So operational experience, definitely one of the key ones there. And it's also the reason lots of the recent publications from the UK financial regulations all have the SMF24, the COO, as the prime kind of owner and responsible person around resilience. The second thing is risk management. Now, there's almost a long discussion and argument which we have around the relationship between resilience and risk management. Which one sits within which? Is risk a function of resilience, or is resilience a risk to be managed? It doesn't actually matter which the answer is. I think it's very clear to everybody there is a very strong relationship between how effective your risk management is and how resilient you are as an organization. If you think about that life cycle I described about how resilience is the ability to prevent as well as respond, recover, learn from disruptions, actually that prevent side can be and is historically one of the largest parts about how you manage resilience as an organization. So anyone who comes at it from that background will hopefully have a lot to add, question and challenge about how the organization manages that side of it. And my only kind of question there would be making sure you don't get dominated by it, because it is also about the assumption that disruptions will occur. And no matter how good you are at preventing them, you need to also have other plans in place for when, unfortunately, those things still happen. Technology. I think even though organizations can have any type of disruption, it can be from physical, people, third parties, technology, data, there's a full spectrum of things that can go wrong. But I think most of the organizations I work with and I see, they're so reliant now on technology and infrastructure, not having that core understanding of how technology works and how it contributes to the outcome your organization is developing really means you're going to have a bit of a blind spot there. So it's not that everybody needs to be technology conversant or knowing anything about coding or planning, but just understanding about how your organization or how your reliance on third parties or part of your ecosystem or infrastructure rely on technology allows you to effectively challenge how your technology environment is being set up to make it achieve the outcome resilience is a very important step. Talking about your ecosystem, I think it's very clear from many disruptions that any of us have been through or have seen or have been part of, that actually they very rarely happen in isolation. We're all so interconnected now, be it through large kind of COVID-style disruptions to parts in the value chain or kind of cloud providers or anyone else who may have a disruption. It very rarely only affects them. So understanding your role and your part of the ecosystem that you operate in is absolutely critical when you want to try and oversee how resilient you are. If you see there's a recent publication by the PRA on outsourcing and how you manage the resilience of that, and there's a lot to be learned and gained by expanding your perimeter of how you look at your resilience and not looking at yourself in isolation, but working up and down your supply chain, up and down your value chain, and in that wider ecosystem that you operate in, and trying to have that challenge and understanding and oversight to make sure that not only yourself are doing what you need to, but that everyone who you're reliant upon is also doing that to the same and appropriate level. I obviously couldn't have written anything without mentioning cyber. It's definitely been something throughout my career that has grown and grown in prominence and importance. Originally, I always used to think of it just as a threat vector, but actually now it's one on its own as one of the biggest and one of the most important areas for everybody to have an understanding of. Now, again, I would never expect a NED to have a deep technical understanding of cyber, the threats and the different preventative controls you may need, but actually just being able to understand the overall operating environment and challenge the organization about how they are prepared. Because sadly, as we've seen many times in many sectors, cyber attacks are becoming more and more prevalent and they're becoming more and more deadly to organizations that aren't prepared for them. But they are still just a resilient risk or a threat to manage, and trying to understand how your operating environment and how you're set up, not only prevent them, but also if they do occur, to manage them as an organization and respond and recover from them is absolutely critical. Last but not least, and hopefully not being too dominated by some technology and cyber things, but I've also kind of got the future technology state. So the whole world is moving on, cloud being one of the most kind of prevalent current examples, as well as, for example, blockchain. Having an understanding of that so that it's not a scary subject, that you at least know enough to be able to challenge and understand why you're moving to adopt a new technology or why you're not, what the risks that brings to the organization, as well as the potentially the resilience benefits of moving to a cloud or a different environment. So none of these things are inherently a good or a bad decision in regards to the resilience of your organization, but you just need to be able to make sure you have some people with the appropriate level of skill and challenge to be able to hold people to account and make sure you've done that strategically and intentionally, rather than just following the crowd or moving into it because it is the next new technology that everyone is going into, and it saves you some money and it may make you more efficient without necessarily understanding the risk and the potential threats you're now exposing yourself to. So that was definitely a bit of a whistle-stop tour. I would say every time I've done any type of board training or board awareness or reviews of board effectiveness, you're never going to get someone with all of them. You're never going to get necessarily all of them across your whole setup. But the ideal for me is always to look at just how you have those complementary skill sets. As always, diversity is the most important thing, and that you can have as many of those different angles and insights to your board as a collective, so that jointly they can kind of provide that most effective challenge and oversight of the organisation, and effectively just be there to understand and ask the right questions, but just knowing just enough so that they can actually provide that next level of challenge and not just effectively be fobbed off by the first answer. So, thanks very much.
Jack, thank you very much indeed. And we turn to I would draw out. At a final point, Robert, in handing back to you, I think the discussion and the audience participation has reminded us that this guide is timely and appropriate. And I'll end by thanking the panel and you, Robert, for pulling the guide together. So back to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Simon. It's a great discussion around all problems many problems that we face. And I hope has highlighted the value of the guide we produced, which you will all get a copy of after this call. So it leaves me really just to thank everybody, like Simon has said, for their valued presentations and contributions this afternoon. And finally, I'd like to say that our next webinar will be on the 15th of July, when we'll be holding a debate, an Oxford Union style debate for the first time, on the motion of this House believes that our resilience standards are not up to standard. So please do join us then, but otherwise, thank you, stay safe, and goodbye.